Welcome to Magical Mystery Talk Episode 3, a little bit later than we had planned to bring it to you. I'm your host Mark Devlin. Over on the line from California we have Desiree Hall. Welcome, Desiree.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
And of course from the UK it's Matt Sergiou of the Occult Beatles blog site. Matt, welcome back.
Hello.
So the last one of these we did was December 2019, and we had planned to bring you the next episode round about March or April of this year to mark the 50th anniversary of the Beatles officially splitting. What we tend to do with these shows is look back at what was happening 50 years ago. We didn't actually make that episode. There were one or two things that kind of came along to distract us and take our time and attention elsewhere.
A little bit.
What was that? Do you know?
Well, I think it was something involving the C word.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I forgot for a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, so we got a little bit distracted, but we've regrouped now, late July 2020, and it seems these days doing any show that doesn't address the aforementioned C word and associated issues, and instead focuses on something completely different, is an act of rebellion and a revolutionary act in itself.
Right. We'll try to steer away from that.
And I'm
okay, yeah. I'm just wondering if we can. Well, let's see.
Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but I'm certainly looking forward to a conversation that doesn't focus on the same subjects that everyone else is talking about. And we just made the comment before we started recording there that it is incredible that even with all this stuff going on in the world, and even down to the fact that this group, the Beatles, split more than 50 years ago now, we still find it fascinating to talk about them, and there's still enough information about them to captivate our interests and imaginations, and that is an amazing feat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so we're just after the 50-year marker for the group officially disbanding.
April 1970 officially, so the mainstream tells us. So the mainstream version of history tells us, yeah.
Yeah, well, the group were effectively all but finished before then, of course. So here we are, summer 2020, on the 50th anniversary of, I guess, the individual members of the group starting to put together their solo projects and go their separate ways and do their own thing.
Yeah. They'd been doing some bits and pieces before then. They'd been releasing what you'd call outside projects, not solo per se, but outside projects away from the Beatles before the Beatles official split in April 70. Like George Harrison had recorded a couple of albums. I think he did Wonderwall music in 68, 69, and he did an electronic album as well. John and Yoko had done some bits and pieces. I think Paul and maybe Ringo were the only ones that hadn't actually done anything. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how the chronology works, the discography works. But yeah,
Mark
did
Lewison.
they? Yeah, we'll ask Mark Lewison. Funnily enough, you mentioned Mark Lewison and the split and everything. The thing is that no one really knows why the Beatles split. I mean, there's lots of we know it was April 70. Okay, that's when the mainstream version of history tells us the Beatles split, because basically what happened was sometime in April 70 came the release of McCartney, which was, supposed to be the first album by Paul McCartney, his first solo album proper, although he'd worked on the Family Way soundtrack, I think in 66 or 67, but it was the questionnaire that came with the album. I don't know if it was available for everybody who bought the album. It was certainly available for the press people. So when the journalists got the copy of the McCartney album in April 70, they had this question and answer sheet inside it. And I think Derek Taylor put it together, the Beatles' trusted PR man. He did like a Q&A thing. So basically he put the questions in and then he left blanks for McCartney to fill out. And that's where the split began, because if I've actually printed a bit of it out, just the killer lines basically, which hit the headlines and sparked the split headlines, and then that was it. After that, essentially, mainstream history says that was it. The Beatles were over after that. It says here, well, I've got the piece of paper here. Here we go. So the question is, are you planning a new album or single with the Beatles? And Paul says no. Next question, is this album a rest away from the Beatles? This McCartney album, is it a rest away from the Beatles or the start of a solo career? And then Paul answers, time will tell. Being a solo album means it's just the start of a solo career, and not being done with the Beatles means it's just a rest. So it's both. Right, that doesn't sound to me like a split. Anyway, question, is your break with the Beatles temporary or permanent, due to personal differences or musical ones? Paul, personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but most of all because I have a better time with my family. Temporary or permanent, I don't really know. Question, do you foresee a time when Lennon and McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again? And he says no. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like a split, but when that question and answer sheet came with the release of the McCartney album, the next day or the day after that in the press, there was Paul quits Beatles, the end of the Beatles are split up. Really? If you read that, right, he says, time will tell, he says. Am I done with the Beatles? He says it means it's just the rest, and it's the start of a solo career, so it's both. And he asks, do you foresee a time? The question is, do you foresee a time in the future? And he says, no, but just because you say, do you foresee a time in the future, it's how you perceive future. Do you foresee a time in the future? What? How long in the future? A week? A year? A decade? A month? 2 months? 3 months? 6 months? So to me, for the mainstream version of history to say, that's it, Paul has now, that's it, it's the end of the Beatles, that to me does not suggest the end of the Beatles. And mentioning Mark Lewison, he was talking about the anniversary. I was listening to one of his interviews or podcasts ages ago now, and for some reason they were talking about 1970 and the split and everything. And his theory is that the Beatles weren't meant to split, that they got caught in this kind of a tidal wave of events that was going on at the time. You had Yoko Ono in the background. You also had John with his heroin addiction, which apparently it now looks, when we look back at history, it seems that John Lennon was acting very erratically at around the time that the split happened, sort of, and in 1969 with the Let It Be sessions, he was acting funny. You also had their business troubles with Apple, and then you had Paul and the other three at loggerheads with Alan Klein. But in amongst all of that, they did record Let It Be album, and they did record Abbey Road. So you could, and they recorded some number one singles as well. So theoretically, you could say that, like Ringo says, yeah, we had problems, we had business problems, and we had squabbles. But when we got into the studio, and the music came in, and the playing in the studio began, all those troubles just went away. So, looking at what Mark Lewison is saying, basically what he's theorizing is, sort of reading between the lines, basically they didn't want to split. They just got caught up in this whirlwind of crazy events that was going on. And then you've got to take into account that each Beatle had their own faction, their own set of friends and fans and close aides and what have you, who were maybe jostling for favour and perhaps were winding it up a little bit, stirring the pot as it were. And so someone on John's side of the fence might be saying to John, hey man, you don't need them, and vice versa with the other three. So yeah, and then you see where, I've actually put together an article about this. It's up on my site, the Occult Beatles, where I look at the attempts during the 1970s where there have actually been attempts. There were actually attempts for the Beatles to reunite. And this is another thing. Okay, I didn't live through the 60s, and I think I say this every time we get together and we chat, but I think I have to say that basically as a disclaimer, because I didn't live through the 60s, so I can only go by what books I've read, what documentaries I've seen, and so on, and interviews I've heard and what have you. But the impression I always had growing up during the 70s and the 80s and 90s and so on is that once the split had occurred, there was no way that the Beatles were ever going to get back together again, that the relationship between them was so bad, was so fractious, that it would never, ever happen. But when you look back now at some people who were there at the time, including a couple of the Beatles themselves, it would appear that is not the case, that was not the case, that there were attempts during the 1970s, at least for Paul and John to get back together to write again and to perform again. And on two of those occasions, those chances, those very real chances, were snatched away under dark circumstances, which would then suggest that there were certain quarters or certain people or bodies that did not want that to happen.
Well, what I find interesting is that we've addressed on previous shows the possibility that the Beatles were a product of social engineering coming out of the Tavistock Institute, and that accusation often gets levelled by researchers at the Rolling Stones as well, with the suggestion that both groups came from the same source and were both involved in pushing agendas. And the Rolling Stones are basically still going to this day. They never retired. So maybe the plan was for the Beatles to continue much longer than they did, but due to personal situations and circumstances that came along, they just weren't able to maintain that longevity in the same way that the Stones have.
Well, what I look at in the article, and I know this is going to be quite radical within the alternative field, but anyone who reads my articles will see that I don't actually have one particular theory. I just judge certain things that I've looked at. I look at certain events or whatever in the Beatles' lives, whether it's during the Beatles' career or before even, or after, and I just look at what I see, and then I report on it, and then I just publish it, and I leave the reader to make up their mind. There's a lot of Beatle researchers. I think me and Desiree, actually, us two are quite different in that we don't have an agenda, or we don't have a theory. We don't lock ourselves into one particular Beatles theory and then set around and then base our articles or our websites or our podcasts or books or whatever on that one particular theory. I certainly don't.
No confirmation bias.
Yeah, basically, because who am I to know? Who knows the truth? Who knows the truth, right? And so, yeah, in this article,
unknown until it's known.
Right, exactly. And who am I to know? Having never even lived in that decade, how would I? I lived for about 6 months of that decade. So, so what I'm saying is, in the article, what I'm proposing is, for the person that's reading it, is right. Okay, so we have this Tavistock thing that you mentioned, Mark, and I've looked at that too. I've looked at the possibility that the Beatles were a vehicle for social engineering, and I'm not. Although I've got some doubts about the Tavistock thing with regards to the way that John Coleman has put it across, I'm not close to that idea at all, not in the slightest. In fact, a lot of my research at the moment is based around the 60s counterculture and the tentacles of other elements creeping into it and directing it. So, but what I'm saying in the article is to the reader, just suspend that belief just for the length of this article and consider this, right? That what happened was either they were a social engineering exercise that they were party to, that the Beatles themselves were a party to, but either that happened or that didn't happen. Maybe they weren't. Whichever. Just suspend your belief on this Tavistock thing and just consider that they were not a social engineering exercise. Or maybe, like I say, they started that way, and then towards the end of the 60s, they began to veer away and drop that. Because if you look at what George was saying towards the end of the 60s, he's saying in more recent years in interviews that the whole LSD acid thing was a con. Then you look at John and what he was doing initially with his peace campaigning, and he was talking about psychopaths, remember? He was talking in the media about psychopaths are running the world, and he was still in the Beatles when he was doing this. So perhaps towards the end, they were beginning to change their agenda, and perhaps they didn't want to go down that road anymore, down the social engineering road, and perhaps they were looking. So with that in mind, then when you look at the attempts that were made during the 70s for Paul and John to get back together, and then that was scuppered under very dark circumstances, then you have to wonder, because it's the way that those attempts for those two to get back together on at least two occasions was stopped due to dark circumstances, which for me would suggest that there might be some credence to this argument that I'm putting forth in the article. The first time it happened, and this is according to May Pang. First, though, what happened was 2 weeks after this Beatles headline split, was in the headlines after the McCartney album came out and this press release and everything. And it said, Paul quits the Beatles in the newspapers. 2 weeks after that, I think it was 2 weeks after that, George Harrison said in an interview, when he was asked would the Beatles get back together again, he said, well, why not? I don't see why we can't get back together again. I think we should go off and do our own things, do our own little solo projects. But I can't see, we owe it to the world is what he said, or something along those lines. We owe it to the world to get back, no pun intended, to get back every year or so, a couple of years, and do a couple of albums. So he's even saying 2 albums in a year. So that's what he was saying. And I've always thought that George was the most dismissive of the Beatles mythos, if you like. He was always the one that was cynical, and even more cynical than John, actually. So there you've got the most cynical member of the Beatles, who was the most cynical towards the Beatles mythos and what they stood for, saying, no, actually, yeah, I can't see why we can't get back together again. And then I think it was a few months after that, maybe a year after that, I can't remember, John Lennon said in an interview, I don't know if the Beatles have split up. If it's over, we might get back together again. I can't see why not. So if you fast forward to 1973, this is where it gets rather, for me, it's like alarm bells ringing. It was in 1973 when him and Yoko split up. Their marriage was on the rocks, and the story goes that she threw him out of the house, threw him out of the Dakota, I think it was at the time. They was living there then, as early as then. And and she sends him off packing with their secretary, May Pang, which, you know, what's going on there? But anyway, and it's a lot of this comes from May Pang. But anyway, in an interview shortly after he left Yoko Ono, who is the person that gets the most of the blame for the Beatles splitting, he was asked in another interview, and I think it was with Elliot Mintz, he was asked in an interview, do you see a time when the Beatles will get back together again? And John Lennon very calmly said, yeah, why not? I don't see why not. We've gone through our little squabbles and our little troubles. Yeah, you know what I'm like, he says. I live day by day. Today I might say yes. Tomorrow I might say no. But yeah, I can't see why not. So now we bring May Pang into the equation. She's talked a lot about John Lennon in recent years. She's written a couple of books about her time with John as well. And she recalls a couple of occasions. Well, she says that, you know, when he was away from Yoko, he was seeing Paul again, that Paul was coming to New York and he was seeing John and they were having dinner together and it was all very friendly. And what she picked up from the two of them was that they loved each other, that they're actually very deep, dear friends. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there was one dinner that she went to with Ringo and John. And they were at a party, I think it was. And they jokingly said, well, it started off as a joke, but then became serious. They said, well, why don't we get back together? Why don't we ring Paul and George and see if we can do a concert together? You know, but that never happened. But here's where something nearly did happen. It was in 74, 75. The story goes, May's actually changed this story a little bit over time. So, but anyway, what she says is, this was around 74, maybe 75. It was after the Band on the Run album had come out by Wings, and McCartney and Wings were scheduled to go to the studio in New Orleans, I think it was, to record the follow-up, which was to be Venus and Mars. And John said to May, what do you think if I was to drop in on Paul and pay him a surprise visit? What do you think if me and Paul got back together again and started writing and recording? And she said, are you serious? What do I think? Get the bloody plane and let's go. So that was the plan. He'd actually put the plans together to get on the plane and go to New Orleans, I think it was, to see Paul, to drop in on Paul and to start writing songs together. Now, depending on which version of May's you believe, because she's talked about this 2 or 3 times, she's written about it as well, and the versions change a little bit. But according to one of the versions, about a day before that reunion was meant to happen, who should call but Yoko? She calls John and she says, I found this hypnotist who is very good at stopping people from smoking. And he says that he can do the same for you. So why don't you pop over to the Dakota and see what he can do for you? And at which point May claims that she said to John, I don't like this. This just doesn't sit well with me. This is a bit creepy. Please don't go. And John assured her that everything was fine. He said, look, it'll be okay. I'll be back in a few hours. It's okay. So off he went. According to one version, he came back later that night. According to the other version, he was gone all weekend. But whatever version you look at, basically, that reunion, that plane trip to New Orleans did not happen because he was at Yoko's with this quote unquote hypnotist. What happened was when he came back, according to one of these versions, when he came back to Maze that day after seeing this hypnotist, he hated Paul. He was talking about how he didn't like Paul. He didn't like the relationship he'd had with him. The Beatles was rubbish. It was a sham. It was this, it was that. And then within a few weeks after that, I think, or a month or two, he was back with Yoko. He left May and he went back with Yoko. According to the other version of that, she saw him in a dentist's office. She didn't see him all weekend. May didn't see him all weekend. And then she went to the dentist. And they'd had an appointment, the two of them, to be at the dentist's that day. So she went to the dentist and she saw John in the office, in the waiting room. And she said he looked like a zombie, like all the life had drained out of him after he'd been to see this hypnotist. And again, this is where we get this thing where he was very dismissive about Paul and he didn't want to see him again. And so that didn't happen. So that was
this is
the
a
next
long time after he wrote How Do You Sleep?
This was a long time, about
Didn't like him then either.
He didn't like him then either, and that's when he was with Yoko, of course, as well. And the second, I mean, there was other times. If you go read the article on the occult Beatles, if you go take a look, you'll see that there's a few other times that this nearly happened. There's also a time where he spoke to Art Garfunkel while he was back with Yoko, asking Art Garfunkel, "Do you think I should get back with Paul?" But the other time that there was a very real chance of it happening, and again it was stopped by very dark circumstances, was in 1980. There was a musical that was going on in Broadway, and it was called Beatlemania. I don't know too much about it, but it's basically a musical which is based on all the Beatles music. So, and the Beatles wanted to stop this musical. They wanted to, over copyright grounds. And one of the grounds that they used, and it's in a sworn affidavit, John Lennon signed this sworn affidavit, stating that the reason he wanted, this is in 1980, this is a few months before he was shot, one of the reasons he wanted this musical to stop was because the Beatles were planning to reunite in the future for a concert, possibly some more music, and also a documentary series. Well, that documentary series did happen. That happened in 1993, 94, 95, I think it was, with the anthology series. And that was a long time project. That actually started in 1970 as The Long and Winding Road, but it took until the 90s for it to happen. So we kind of know that's kind of true. That was going to happen. And then you also get this rumor that Central Park had been booked for 1980 for a Beatles concert, a Beatles reunion concert. Now, the bit where I nearly fell off my chair. I was watching this documentary. It was called The Story of Top of the Pops, which basically, for anyone who's not in the UK, it was a music program, a long-running music show program in the UK, parts of Europe as well. And this was a documentary about that TV show I was watching on the BBC, and it was The Story of 1980. So it was basically the story of music from 1980. And as it got towards the end of it, it reached December. And they were talking to Richard Skinner, who used to be a DJ on BBC Radio 1, which is like the youth station for the UK. And he also used to host this program called Newsbeat on Radio 1, which was basically a news program for that station, like a youth version of the news, if you like. And he was like the editor and the main presenter. And he recalls he heard about John's death while he was lying in bed late at night, early hours of the morning. It came up on the radio. He jumped out of bed, got dressed, jumped into his car, drove to the Radio 1 studios, and he got his phone book out, and he had Paul McCartney's number, and he thought, shall I ring this? Because I need to get a statement off him about what's happened overnight. So he phoned it, and somebody else answered the phone. He said, I'm sorry, Paul's not available at the moment, but I'll pass on the message. He thought, oh, all right. So he puts the phone down. Within seconds or a few minutes, the phone rings. He picks it up. Hello, it's Paul. Oh, okay. He says, are you ready to, and Richard asks him if he's willing to talk on the radio about, his reaction to John's shooting and everything. And he says, no, he wanted to speak off the record. And what he said off the record was that John Lennon shouldn't have even been in New York on that day he was shot. there was studio time booked for him and Paul to get together to work on new material with the view to record new songs. But what happened was there was a double booking at the studio. They'd double booked. So what they had to do was reschedule. So if it hadn't have been for that, then John, yeah. So basically
which
shooting...
Studio, which studio would this have been, Matt?
He didn't say. But from what I can gather, it would have been
in New
the
York
UK.
or elsewhere?
I think it would have been the UK. From what I can gather from the bits and pieces I've pulled together, because Yoko Ono has even said, she brought a statement out. I can't remember when it was, and it's actually on my article. She posted a statement. Maybe it was an interview anyway, but she states that, yes, John was planning to come to the UK in 1981 with a view to a reunion with Paul and the rest of the lads. So, yeah, but then this shooting happened and that put the end.
Right.
And this has been confirmed also by Jack Douglas, who was the producer of the Double Fantasy album, John's last recorded, the last album that he worked on that was released. And Jack Douglas claims that he knew that Paul was going to the Dakota and writing with John and playing guitars and jamming away with him at the Dakota, and that he was calling as well. But he claims that he was calling John and Yoko would take the phone and say, "Oh no, John doesn't want to speak to you," and put the phone down. So she was what he's insinuating is that she was in the middle of it, kind of making it look between the two of them. So John would then assume that, or Paul would then assume, oh, John doesn't want to speak to me. Oh, all right then. Oh, what have I done to him then? You know, she was kind of in the middle of that, sort of breeding this kind of bad feeling between the two of them. But yeah, whatever. There's so many people there who were close to it who have said that, yes, they were going to get back together again. And then bang, this shooting occurred. Literally bang. So that's what I'm saying here. In the article, what I'm proposing is just suspend this Beatles were baddies. You know, perhaps towards the end they weren't. Perhaps. But anyway, I'm not saying that I subscribe to that view. I don't subscribe to any view. But I'm just saying, look, here's some information. You know, do what you want with it. Read it and read it and judge for yourself.
Sure. Anything to add to that, Desiree?
Oh, not too much. I think it was pretty well covered there. But,
I'll just add. I was just sorry. I just remembered that just a few weeks ago, after I'd published that article, just about 2-3 weeks ago, Ringo came out and said that they'd actually talked about getting back together. It was in the news about 2-3 weeks ago. So this came out This story came out a few weeks after my article was published on the Occult Beatles. Ringo came out and said something along the lines of, in 1975, the Beatles were offered a £200 million deal in today's money, what would have been 50 million then, in 1975, to get back together again for a concert. But what stopped them from doing it, bizarrely, was that the organizer, the promoter, wanted to do like a fish wrestling or shark. He wanted to have a shark wrestler as the opening act. And it was basically, they called each other and said, shall we do this? And they said, no, because they're doing this shark thing. No.
There was another incident I heard as well on Saturday Night Live. I think Ringo was headlining Saturday Night Live in New York, and they had put out live, and we know Paul and John are in the area, come on down, and something like that, but it never came out as well.
Yeah, so. They were at the Dakota. Paul and John were at the Dakota watching TV, right. And they just happened to switch Saturday Night Live on, and the presenter said, I will give them X amount of money if they turn up now and if they reunite or something. And they looked at each other and said, shall we do it? Shall we just hop in a cab and just go over? It's only down the road. It's only a couple of blocks away. Why don't we just go and do it? But yeah, they didn't do it. But too that they were both at the Dakota together, hanging out together.
Right, because the mainstream, paradigm that we get is that they never hung out. They didn't like each other. They were, not friends at that point, and obviously that they were, because they hadn't seen each other and made plans to do things together and possibly reunite and all that. So, and it wasn't until after John was out of the picture in the anthology project that George and Ringo and Paul got together for that anthology project. And it was fine, without John. But, it's like, why was John always the deciding figure in that? It seemed like something was keeping him away, or someone.
Yeah.
Or organization.
But according to this affidavit, if it's true, this signed affidavit, the plans were there in 1980 for this anthology to actually take place sometime in the 1980s. And presumably that's perhaps why he was coming to the UK as well, to work with Paul and then to get this documentary moving along. Because we know now for a fact that this anthology began life as The Long and Winding Road in 1970. It was actually that long. Neil Aspinall, actually the Beatles' sort of manager, if you like, after Brian died and Alan Klein was off the scene. Neil Aspinall, their one-time roadie and then their manager, their business manager, actually put together a pilot demo film of The Long and Winding Road that they were going to work on, like a rough version. And I think you can find it online as well.
Matt, when you hear comments like Ringo's shark wrestling anecdote that he comes out with randomly, do you ever get the impression that he might be an avid reader of the Occult Beatles blog site, and that when we get statements like this, they might actually be in direct reaction to the sort of stuff that researchers like us have been saying, that, parties close to the Beatles keep an eye on the postings on social media and YouTube and such, and occasionally they respond to what we've been saying?
Yeah, I don't want to sound big-headed, but I do get that gut feeling, and I don't deny my gut feeling. The other time that happened was, remember the Egypt Station album by Paul McCartney? Do you remember before that album came out a few months before or a few weeks before, he was putting teaser posts on his Twitter page with the graphics of the forthcoming album that was going to be on the cover. What was the first graphic on there? If you look at my Conspiromedia site with the pyramid triangle and the ball on the top, the ball of positive light coming out, I nearly fell off my chair again. It's almost exactly the same. He did exactly the same, almost exactly the same logo.
Quite a coincidence.
Coincidence, yeah. I'll go with coincidence. I don't want to get too big-headed or.
It does make you wonder, though.
It does make you wonder. It does. It does.
It could all be coincidence, but you know what? Sometimes when coincidences like that happen, it's kind of seems like it's a little bit more than coincidence.
Yeah.
I think
I had really gotten into Paul McCartney's artwork for a long time, and Egypt Station, that particular piece that he did, was always fascinating to me because it was so unlike all of the other ones that he did. Mm-hmm. And just the fact that, he called it Egypt Station and it had like this Egyptian type motif to it. It was just very interesting because we had already gone into the fact that, possibly the Beatles themselves have some kind of an ancient Egyptian theme kind of surrounding them with the whole Beatle thing and everything, and then he makes this painting that's completely unlike any of the other paintings that he's ever done, calls it Egypt Station. And, my friends and I in our same little circles had, long in-depth conversations about the symbolism on that particular painting. And then he comes out with that album. It's just odd timing, odd coincidences all around, as usual.
Well, I think we should move on to the next talking point on the agenda. And we've made the point in previous shows that the number of individuals with first-hand knowledge and memories of working with the Beatles right at the sharp end is very, very small now. Most of them have gone, and it's diminishing by the year. And we lost another one just recently, a couple of months ago, in the form of the photographer Astrid Kircherr, who passed away and she was involved in the very early days of the Beatles during their Hamburg period. And Desiree, we've said before that it's interesting enough talking about the post-fame years of the Beatles, when they blew up and became a sensation and a household name, but it can be very fascinating also to look at those early years before they broke through, before they had fame, because there's lots of interesting and mysterious and curious stuff in those very early days, and Astrid figured very much in those. So maybe you want to take up the conversation about the passing of Astrid Kircherr.
So 1960, I guess, is kind of the official date of when the Beatles kind of formed as is. And they started out playing little gigs and like high school dances and whatnot, just little things around in Liverpool. But then they had their manager at the time, Alan Williams, who owned the Jacaranda Club, shipped them as well as other Liverpoolian bands out to Hamburg, Germany. And they were playing in like the red light district out there, this very seedy, full of sex, drugs, and rock and roll type shady kind of places out there. And that's where it said that they really honed in on their style and their music, and kind of made them from the greasy bad boys that they were into the more defined good boy Beatles that they became. But anyhow, they met out there, Astrid and Klaus Voormann, and the man, I can never pronounce his name correctly, Jürgen Vollmer. And Astrid is said to have given the Beatles their Beatle haircut. And she's a fascinating figure because even more than Brian Epstein in a lot of ways, she had a lot of influence on the early Beatles style by changing their haircut. And in my opinion, I think that it was during that time in Hamburg that they met somebody or something, and possibly related to the whole Astrid circle, that made them what they are. They went from not being known to being this huge giant sensation after meeting Astrid and after playing in those seedy Hamburg places. And they obviously got their start from there. I don't know if Matt has anything to add to that, but the Jürgen Vollmer, who doesn't get as much publicity from this time, but he was an assistant to William Klein, who was a photographer, pretty well-known photographer, I guess, in that area. And William Klein has photo books that, if you go and look online, they're between $800 and $1,500 to get one of these books that he published, his photography books. And he had photography books from Moscow, from China, and his main thing was people on the street, just everyday people in these different far-off countries. He was born in New York and raised in New York, but somehow during this Cold War time had access to Moscow, to Germany, to the UK, to China, to Korea, all of these places that he's taken these pictures at and published in his books. And to me, it seems like, again, just like Matt was saying, I didn't grow up in the 60s, but I've only know what I have read and the impressions that I get. But I don't think it was very simple to just travel the world in the 60s unless you were very well-rounded, had a lot of money, or had a lot of connections, right? Especially places like Moscow and China. How are you going to get pictures of like everyday people walking down the streets in Moscow without having some kind of a connection? Like, that just seems very, very strange to me. And so Jürgen Vollmer was William Klein's assistant, and was living at the time, I believe, with Klaus Voormann. and Klaus Voormann and Astrid Kircherr were supposedly dating. And according to the story, as soon as Astrid saw the Beatles play in a very seedy place in Germany, she absolutely fell in love with the Beatles, their sound, their style, and fell in love with Stuart Sutcliffe, the bass player, who was also an artist. And according to the tales, didn't even really want to be a musician, but John kind of forced him into that role. And it's interesting to me because Stuart Sutcliffe didn't speak any German, or very little, and Astrid didn't speak any English, or very little, and yet they hit it off almost immediately and became engaged, and were just, she somehow, she was already living with Klaus Voormann, and I'm done with you, I'm going on to Stuart now, and it just seemed like a very strange kind of story. Like there seems to be pieces missing in there somewhere. I don't know if you have any more to add to that, Matt, but that's always just been a very
she's very mysterious lady.
Yes.
You published an article about her, didn't you? And you struggled to find anything much about her, didn't you? I think you found out some things about her father working for Ford, was it? Or?
Yeah, she had a very big family, and I think she had like 6 sisters and like 5 brothers or something like that. A very large family. And yeah, the only thing that's really said is her father was an executive of the Ford Motor Company, the branch in Germany. So in the 40s and the 50s. So that makes you wonder right there, that's World War II and post World War II, working for Ford in Germany. Like that's just kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
And Ford, has had all kinds of conspiracy theories about it, and that they really supplied all the engines and whatnot for the
Nazi sympathizer Henry
exactly.
Ford, and exactly. Anti-Semitism, quote unquote, and
right. So who knows? But it seems very, very odd that an executive of the Ford Motor Company, they obviously were well off. They had a large family, and Astrid's always at least portrayed as this very kind of well-to-do, modern. She obviously didn't struggle. Why she was in the red light district of Hamburg watching rock and roll shows of these seedy so-called bad boy rock, guys, who knows? But that's as the story goes, and that's kind of what we have to go with, I suppose.
Yeah, I've tried to look into her biography to find out some other things, interviews that she gave, and there's nothing. I mean, there's interviews,
nothing.
But she just kind of repeats. Pretty much, she kind of repeats what happened in Germany, i.e., it was her boyfriend at the time, Klaus Voormann, who then went on to play bass for Manfred Mann, I think, in the 60s, and has since he's now a top session musician, and he played with the Plastic Ono band, so he really got in with the Beatles when they became famous, so he became friends with them, and then when they became successful, he kind of like rode on the crest of the wave, if you like. He was an art student, and then you had Jürgen, who gave... I think it was Paul and John. They went to visit him in Paris in 1960, 61, and that he gave them their Beatle haircut, the mop top, the forward, because they apparently, so the story goes, they were the only ones who had this haircut. Everyone else had this rocker teddy boy kind of haircut, or they were squares, they were straights, and they had the crew cut shaved thing. And then there's these artists, these all clad in black, Astrid, Klaus, Jürgen, with the combed down hair, which looked absolutely unusual, I would imagine at the time. It would have been like somebody now with really, really long hair down to their arse, It's that kind of thing, It's like, wow, look, people turning their heads in the street. That's the story you get, isn't it? And then they turn up in this club. They hear the Beatles playing in this club in Hamburg, and she falls in love with their sound, and she goes out with Stuart. But that's all pretty much we know, isn't it? And there's no biography. She didn't write an autobiography, and no biography, as far as I'm aware, has ever been written about her. It's just, you would have thought if anyone knew anything about the early Beatles, it would have been Astrid. So how come we haven't had any books? Not even not even from her, for example, but even from an independent outside author who might want to look into the early Beatles? Why haven't they thought to themselves, hey, look, here's Astrid, this person who hasn't really talked about what went on. Let's try and find out what she was about. No one's really done it.
Matt, why don't you address Paul McCartney's apparent bad memory when he was called on to give some comments about Astrid passing?
Yeah, so this one's for the PID crowd, for the PIDs. Okay, I've got it on the computer. I'm just looking for it right now. I think it's right in front of me. Here we go. Wait a minute, I'll just say that also, the With the Beatles cover, the Beatles' second album, where you've got the picture, the black and white picture of them, shaded which is the symbologist's dream, it's got them with the half shadow thing. So when you look at it, it's half their faces, it's just their faces, and it's half black, half light, and it's just their one eye, one of their eyes showing of each member. So it's got all that. So for a symbologist who's looking at particular types of things, they might say, hey, look here, we've got an early version, or perhaps one of the first bits of evidence of famous musicians doing the one eye symbolism, because it is just their faces with shadows, black and white, with the shadow covering half their faces and their eyes showing on the other side where the light is. Officially speaking, that the credit for that photograph, for that With the Beatles album, their second album, which came out in November 1963, officially the credit of that photograph the idea behind it goes to Robert Freeman, the photographer, who also went on to photograph a few of their other albums after that. That's the official story. And the official story is, according to Paul McCartney, they were in a hotel in Bournemouth, in the town of Bournemouth in the UK. I think that must have been when they were on a UK concert tour, and Freeman turned up. It was all very improvised, all very ad hoc. And according to McCartney's version, they went into the passageway, the corridor of the hotel, and it was a dark corridor, and Freeman had them sit at the end, and there was just a little bit of light, a shaft of light that was shining through the darkness, and that's why you get that one-eyed thing. Okay. According to Freeman's version, slightly different. He says it was in the hotel in Bournemouth, but it was in the dining room, and he had them sit in front of a dark black, I think, pair of curtains, and there was a shaft of light coming through and giving us that one eye thing. So it's all so basically what they're saying is it was random, it was ad hoc, it wasn't planned. Freeman didn't even turn up with makeup artists or anybody. He just came and he said, okay, guys, sit there, click, click, click. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. And again, according to the official story, the reason they chose Freeman was because he was quite well known at the time for his black and white photographs. Apparently, he was famous for taking black and white pictures of jazz musicians. He'd done some with John Coltrane, I think. But it would appear that might not actually be true, because Astrid, I don't know how long after the event, but maybe decades after that album came out and the photograph with the cover and everything, she intimated quite subtly that she said she liked Robert Freeman's photograph for the With the Beatles, and she said it was I can't remember the exact quote, but she was kind of saying it was a very good imitation of what I used to do, because apparently that's what she used to do. That this was her trademark photographic style, the half one eye, black and white. So if you're into symbology, you could say it's black and white. So it's the darkness and the light. So good and bad, good and evil, duality, and then you've got the one eye. Well, basically that style of photography, she claims, came from her. And there is some confirmation to that, because if you look at some of those photographs that did come out later, yes, in 1962, at the end of 62, when the Beatles went to Hamburg for the last time, because their Love Me Do, their first single, had come out in October, and they were starting to get a bit of fame nationally in Britain. And they didn't really want to go to Hamburg again and play in a club, but Brian Epstein kind of made them do it because he didn't want them to dishonour their bookings and get a bad reputation from that. He was quite good about that sort of thing, apparently. So they went to Hamburg and they were greeted at the airport by Astrid, so the story goes, and that's when she told them that Stuart had died, because he stayed on in Hamburg, of course, when the Beatles went back to Britain. He stayed with Astrid, and she told them that he died a day or so before. At which point John and George went to the apartment that Stuart and Astrid shared, and she took some pictures of John and George, and you can find them. You'll find them on my website, actually, The Occult Beatles. If you type in the title of the article, which is called Cover Up and then question mark, I've got the pictures there, but they're very easy to find. Late 1962, probably December, I think, but anyway, late 1962, and they are almost identical to the pictures on the cover of With the Beatles. So you have John and George with the half shadow and one eye showing, almost identical. So
and it was taken in her attic or something, was that right?
Yeah, that's right, art studio or something like that she shared with Stuart. Yeah. So on to this tweet. I think it was a tweet that came out a few days after Astrid had passed. Let me just find it. I've got it here on the computer. Yes, she says, right, okay, well, I'll just say it. And then, okay, here we go. She had a great sense of humour and later went on to marry Stuart, our bass player. I have so many fond memories of our time together in the club or her home or a trip to the nearby seaside resort, Lübeck. Okay, so there you go. Well, she didn't marry Stuart. She didn't marry Stuart, for a start. And I think, Mark, we were chatting online a few weeks ago about Lübeck. Apparently it's not really a seaside resort.
Yeah, I was pretty sure it was inland and not on the coast, and checked it out on a map, and that is the case.
So either age has caught up with a certain person's memory, or this certain person isn't the certain person that some people might think he is. Yeah. So odd one, that, isn't it? You know, I never knew the Beatles, but I knew that Stuart didn't marry Astrid. You know, so yeah.
Apparently, the lyrics to "In My Life" off the Rubber Soul album, written by John Lennon, referenced Stuart Sutcliffe, according to breakdowns of the song, where he says "Some are dead and some are living," thinking about people in his past. That was a reference to Stuart Sutcliffe.
The Baby in Black was supposed to be about that as well, and that entire song was supposed to be about Astrid and her mourning towards Stu. And I always found it interesting because there's a line in there that says, "Oh, how long will it take till she sees the mistake that she has made?" Yeah. And so I always the whole rest of the song makes complete sense. She's in mourning and she's wearing black, and it's sad mourning time over this love lost that she apparently had. But what was the mistake that she made? And why isn't she able to see this mistake that she's made, but John is able to see it? It's very interesting. So I've always wondered about that line in that song.
And they were existentialists, weren't they? I mean, so the story goes that Astrid and Klaus and Jürgen, they were all always dressed in black, and they had this, what was then this different haircut, which then went on to be known as the Beatle mop top. But they were also existentialists as well. Really, So I know you've looked into that as well, a bit, Desiree. Yeah,
and in French, that existentialist movement was called Les Beat, which is Beatles.
Les Beat.
Which is very strange. Les Beat, right? So I found that's just another crazy Beatles coincidence, I suppose.
Wow. And they did actually come up with the name Beatles before they went to Hamburg and met Astrid. Right. So then that makes you wonder, wow. It's just, like we were saying at the beginning, what makes the Beatles so fascinating to talk about for some of us, 50, 60 years afterwards? Well, that's there you go, Right.
Let's bring things up to date and topical then, and I guess we can't avoid addressing the C word issue because it kind of has dominated everyone's lives the last few months, and that also is the case with Paul McCartney, who of course was roped in to take part in this bloody awful One World at Home concert curated by Lady Gaga, which was supposed to make us all feel very grateful that we're on lockdown and we're at home and we can look at our screens and watch all these big rock stars like Elton John and Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney and whoever else performing for us from their living rooms, all alone, of course, in isolation like the rest of us. But yeah, Paul McCartney was a part of that whole thing, obviously given the instruction, and there he was, keeping up his end of the deal, helping to push the official narrative. And then we've got the song Penny Lane and how that ties into the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Antifa type situation, which kind of rode off the back of the C-word story. So Matt, maybe you want to get into that.
Well, I've got to say, I there are certain things I cannot do and will not do, and one of those was watch that blooming COVID corona drama. No chance, no way am I going to watch that crap. So I don't know what happened. I have no idea. I didn't even read up on it to find out what happened afterwards. I really don't want to know. I just don't. I can't stand.
It wasn't a good review. Let's just say that.
Yeah, short and to the point, which is rare for me as well.
Right.
But what Ringo does is I might be wrong, but every year when it's his birthday, he does like a public birthday party or something.
He does. It's funny because I've always wanted to go just to see, but so his birthday's on July 7th, which is 7/7, right?
Yeah.
Those interesting numbers right there. But every year in front of the Capitol Records building in Hollywood, he holds like a little concert, like just a little something or other. He gives out, wristbands or, something like that. And at noon every year on his birthday, he likes to have a moment of silence for his peace and love and this kind of thing. So, and I've actually always wanted to go, and every single year something comes up to where I am just unable to go. It's only about an hour drive for me, a little bit more, an hour and 20 minutes. It would be so simple to go and be able to just check it out one time. But every single year, something has come up for me that just made it unable for me to go. And this year was no different because they didn't even have it. We weren't allowed to travel or do anything anyway. So
this year it was the C word.
Well, the whole of 2020 is cancelled, basically, isn't it?
2020 is just, oh my gosh.
But would you be happy to know that you can watch what he did instead of that? It's now available on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken.
Woo-hoo!
He did a live stream. Yes, he invited all his showbiz friends. He wheeled out all the usual agenda pushers.
Oh, good. I've not had enough time looking at screens these past few months. I could really do with a few more hours.
Oh, it's the new normal. It's the new normal, Mark. Don't you know that yet? Yeah. Come on, get with the program. So, so because he couldn't do this thing that you say, Desiree, this live birthday thing. So what he did this year on July 7th was have a live stream. So he was... I didn't watch it. I can't stomach this stuff, all this schmaltzy crap. He basically, from what I've read in the articles the reports, basically he just invited people that he knows, music friends and what have you, to play little songs, like little video clips, and he also had little live clips from friends of his to say, "Hi Ringo, happy birthday," and all that kind of stuff. I think George Martin's son, Giles Martin, said hello, and loads of others. Mick Fleetwood. I'm just looking at the names here on the computer screen. I've got one of the articles up. Ron Howard, Niels Lofgren. I think McCartney was there too. Olivia Harrison. The reason I'm mentioning this is the stream, according to this article. Actually, it's not just according to this article. This is actual fact, because if you look at the official YouTube video, you'll see it on the credits. The stream was raising money for WaterAid and also Black Lives Matter.
Right.
So,
speaking of the Black Lives Matter, it's interesting because that all blew up in, I think it was end of May or somewhere in that time. And it was a pretty big deal here. I was curious as to how worldwide it had actually become, but I knew that here it was quite a big deal. And I said to a friend of mine, I was like, Paul McCartney is always so on top of this stuff, like I can't believe he hasn't made a statement yet about this and what we should all do. I'm sure people are just waiting for him to make a public statement on this. And lo and behold, the very next day, he comes out on Twitter and made an official statement about the Black Lives Matter movement. I can read it if you want. It says, as we continue to see the protests and demonstrations across the world, I know many of us want to know just what we can be doing to help. None of us have the answers, and there is no quick fix, but we need change. We all need to work together to overcome racism in any form, and we need to learn more, listen more, talk more, educate ourselves, and above all, take action. In 1964, the Beatles were due to play in Jacksonville in the U.S., and we found out that it was going to be a segregated audience. They felt wrong. We said, we're not doing that. And the concert we did was to their first non-segregated audience. We then made sure that this was in our contract, because to us it seemed like common sense. I feel sick and angry that there are almost 60 years later, and the world is in shock at the horrific scenes of the senseless murder of George Floyd at the hands of police, racism, along with countless others that came before. All of us here support and stand alongside all of those who are protesting and raising their voices at this time. I want justice for George Floyd's family. I want justice for all those who have died and suffered. Saying nothing is not an option. Love, Paul McCartney. And so he comes out with this statement, which, you know, I don't know if anybody was on their toes, like waiting for him to say something, but I knew that he would. And it wasn't a day or two later that Penny Lane in Liverpool was vandalized, which I thought was highly ironic, considering, you know, he just made this lovely peace and love statement.
Fortuitous timing.
Right, for all the world to see. And then, boom, here we go with debates over Penny Lane and whether or not it had some sinister origins for the naming of
allegedly, yeah.
Allegedly.
So, yeah. What happened was, I think I've seen the pictures from the news reports. Penny Lane, of course, is a real road, a real area, made famous by the Beatles, of course, in their song. But I've seen the pictures. Some people had gone there and spray painted Penny, I think, off the road signs in black spray paint. And I think there was a photograph I saw of a road sign with Penny Lane on it, and behind the sign someone had spray painted racist. And apparently this boils down to the allegation, the claim, the belief by some or many, I don't know, that the area was named after James Penny, who was around in the 1700s. He was a merchant. I don't think he was born in Liverpool, but he was based in Liverpool because, of course, Liverpool back during the slave trade days, the black slave trade days, made a lot of money. Liverpool made a lot of huge fortune, built much of its fortune back then on the black slave trade. Apparently he was around in the 1700s when all this was going on. He was a merchant. Apparently he captained, from one source I've read, he captained 11 voyages of slave ships. And then what happened was when in Britain they were trying to abolish the slave trade, James Penny was actually one of 5 people in the country, I think it was, who was selected to go to Parliament in Britain to lobby, what we would call now lobby against this move to abolish the slave trade, because basically if that had come to pass in their eyes, then it would destroy their living. It would not only destroy the slave traders' livings, but it would also destroy the vast fortunes that was going to Liverpool. And apparently, Liverpool Town Council at the time awarded James Penny with a Freeman of the Borough of Liverpool, in thanks, basically, not only for generating so much wealth for the city, but also for going to London and, well, unsuccessfully, but nevertheless, for going to London and trying to lobby against the abolishment of the slave trade. I actually looked into this some years back for the very first article that I put up on the Occult Beatles on WordPress, the very first article that I put up on there. And I looked a little bit into this, and I came to the understanding that Penny Lane was named after James Penny by none other than the National Slavery Museum, which is based in Liverpool. I looked on their official website at the time, back then in 2016 or 2017, whenever it was, and it actually stated that Penny Lane was named after James Penny. Now, what's happened is what the National Slavery Museum have claimed since then was that earlier this year, even before the Corona dramas started, Liverpool Council were planning to, I don't know if they've done it, but there was plans to put up some historic blue plaques around the city. And so basically what they wanted to do before they did that, they needed to liaise with with the Slavery Museum, but also various historians and researchers and authors and what have you in that area to basically confirm bits of history. So they could make sure that the bits of history that they were putting on these blue plaques and then erecting onto certain buildings in the city were as true as could possibly be. So from that, so the National Slavery Museum in Liverpool claims, they then went and took another look at this Penny Lane claim that it was named after James Penny. And apparently they liaised with one or two historians and a Liverpool slavery historian. And to quote them from their website on a press release, there is no historical evidence linking Penny Lane to James Penny. And there's also another researcher, another historian, who's been looking into this for years, and I think he's based in Liverpool as well. And he claims that Penny Lane back in the 1840s was actually named Penny's Lane, and then it was later changed to Penny Lane. So all of this fuss would appear to have been for nothing. The road signs have since been cleaned up, as far as I'm aware, and life has kind of gone back to normal. But when I was looking at that article, when I was looking at researching for this article that I mentioned, the very first article on my site, the article itself is called In the Beginning. And it's basically looking at the world that the Beatles grew up in, basically the world of Liverpool. So, we hear these stories that the Beatles were into the occult and into the esoteric, but from my impression, from a lot of the research and a lot of the websites and stuff that you get to see and the people that you get to hear talk about this, the impression that I get is that the Beatles didn't really get into the occult and into esoteric subject matter and looking at that and following it to a large degree until they found fame and they came to London, and then they met these the intelligentsia, if you like, so to speak, the poets, the artists and the occultists that were based in London. And I think there is some truth to that. I think what happened was, I think they knew, and I think they were tuned into that stuff when they were very, very young, in the pre-fame days, when they were in their early teens even. And there's lots of evidence, I think, that pinpoints that and looks towards that being the case. And I'll be looking at this in a future article. All you need to look at, for an example, though, is the Casbah Club, where they came from. If you look at the symbols that they painted, they were paid to paint that club before they were even called the Beatles. And if you look at the symbology that they used as young kids, students, some of the members of the Beatles at that time, pre-Beatles, were still at school. I think John was at art college. But if you look at the symbols that they painted to decorate that club, quite occult, I have to say. But so this article basically looks at their early, not them as such, but the Liverpool that they came from. And if you look at Liverpool, it's steeped in standing stones, ancient stones. There's road names named after druids. A couple of them are near where Paul and John lived as kids, as youngsters. And there's also lots of stories of hauntings, ghostly, so-called quote unquote supernatural tales. The reason I mention this is because there is I went to Liverpool about a year ago or 2 years ago with my other half, and we were going to the Docklands, Albert Dock. I think it's called Albert Dock, isn't it? The Docklands there in Liverpool. Yeah. And my missus was saying to me, my other half was saying to me, I feel really creeped out here. There's like a weird energy. I don't like this area. It just feels, I don't know, it just feels a bit dark. It feels a bit, I can't put my finger on it. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something that didn't sit well with her. And she's got every reason to think that, actually, because as I state in this article, I quote a couple of bits from a book by John Reppion, who I think is a Liverpool-based author, and he deals in the occult a bit, and his name's John Reppion. And I've got a quote from his book, 800 Years of Haunted Liverpool, and he mentions the connection to Liverpool's slave trade days. And there were reports, quote unquote, this is from his book, of spectral arms. And this is at Albert Dock. Albert Dock was renovated. I don't know how long ago it was, about 20 odd years ago. So if you go to that Albert Dock area now, it's full of trendy bars. I think there's a Beatles museum. Yeah, there's a Beatles museum there because I've been in it. And it's like a trendy area. It's got little boutique shops and bars and restaurants and stuff. But whilst that renovation work was going on to make it like that on the dock, there were reports, according to Repian's book, quote unquote, of spectral arms reaching out towards the workmen as they sandblasted the walls, which still had slave chains attached to them. And then he also writes about another area close to the Albert Dock where allegedly African slaves were held and confined to cells in that part of the city before being shipped off to the plantations in America, and the sound and the feel of restless souls that died there whilst they were chained there in Liverpool, and they now haunt that area. So I just thought I'd add that in because it's kind of topical, I suppose.
Well, Matt, we were supposed to visit Liverpool together a couple of years ago. I think it was now summer 2018, and we were going to visit some of these mysterious Beatles sites, and we had a couple of guys lined up to be tour guides that knew the area very well, and it never happened. And I kind of kicked myself because I cancelled one of the dates. I couldn't do it myself, and we just put it off. And now God knows if we're ever going to get to do it, we're, the situation being what it is. In the meantime, I did go around some of the key London sites related to the Beatles and did some filming there, and I put that up on YouTube just the other month because I didn't know how long it would be before we get the Liverpool one done, if we ever did. But it is still something I'd like to do, but who knows if we'll ever get the chance now.
That in the beginning, the article that I just mentioned, that I just read a bit from, my intention is to do a part 2, and I just mentioned it a minute or two ago. But I was holding back for that visit we were going to take so I could get a first-hand look and possibly some photographs, take some photos as well. But yeah. So
the song Imagine, John Lennon's song, figures in this whole current narrative as well, because a few weeks ago we got a new version of the song in the form of a video. All kinds of loathsome celebrities were taking a verse each and coming with these sickening, sanctimonious sentiments. And that song has been adopted for various agendas going on at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Desiree, we were chatting on the chat thing a couple of days or so ago, and you mentioned something about Cuba and communism and stuff. Because I've found a few bits and pieces to do with somebody who wants to get rid of the Star Spangled Banner as the American anthem, and to replace it with Imagine. And I've looked a little bit into this guy's background, the guy that is making the most noise about this. And there's some very interesting little, isn't there always? He's got an interesting background, but I don't know if that ties into what you've found. It probably does in a roundabout way. What have you found?
Well, there's a couple things. So first of all, years ago, I think in 2014 or something, I did an article about the Beatles' kind of offshoot connection to Cuba, which seems very strange. But Cuba, of course, was during the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that, was a big issue with the Cold War and communism and all of that stuff. But I don't know how known it is by many, but United States has a base in Cuba, supposedly right at the very spot where they say Columbus disembarked and started the whole American New World thing. And it's called Guantanamo Bay. And they use this base to basically for prisoners of war, for spies and such. They, if someone is deemed a terrorist, they have the right to take this person without due process and contain them here in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and they're could never be heard from again. And I was looking into it for something completely unrelated to Beatles, and just to get a better idea of this base that we had there at one time and years ago. And I come to find out that they named certain spots of this in Guantanamo Bay on this base after Beatles songs. which is very, very strange. So there's this one area where they take the most dangerous spies that they've captured from the war on terror, from Afghanistan and Iraq and Middle Eastern places of that nature. And they have this counter spy training facility where they take these terrorists and these spies and they recondition them into being pro-U.S. or whatever they might do in order to turn these prisoners of war. And the area that they're kept is called Penny Lane, which is just very strange. And then the outlying area where they keep all of this most dangerous criminals of war is called Strawberry Fields. And what possessed them to name these areas these things is beyond me. And this is been more recent. It wasn't like these were named in the 60s when the Beatles were really popular. These were named these things. The United States didn't even know this existed as far as the general public is concerned.
It reminds me of
like 2015 or something like that, when these documents were released by the Freedom of Information Act or whatnot.
Well, also, there was this absolutely absurd story we got when ISIS terror events were all the rage. And apparently there was this group of die-hard fanatical jihadi terrorists that called themselves the Jihadi Beatles. And we were told that they had their leader, Jihadi John, and presumably there was a Jihadi Ringo in there as well. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, but I wonder why the Beatles were woven into that narrative. There's another very interesting question.
It is strange, right? And again, you have this area in Cuba that we actually rent this area, and we've been paying rent to Cuba for that we have had no relations with until recently. We've cut them off of trade, and they're like this horrible country that we're not allowed to visit or buy anything from. Yet we rent this area for our own base and pay Cuba to keep our facility there, named after Beatles songs. And it's so highly secretive that nobody knows really what's going on there. And it's just the very strangest thing. And, back in the 60s, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that with Russia and the KGB, stationing their missiles there and whatnot and threatening the United States. Well, we had a base there the entire time. It's so strange to me that it's like, what really? There's the story that we get, and then there's the real story. And I don't think they're not flowing together. I think that there's so many secrets that we just have no idea about. That if they do come to light, it's only like a small fraction of exactly what happened.
And there's that statue, isn't there? The John Lennon Isn't there a John Lennon statue in Cuba?
Yes. So in Havana, they have their main square there in front of like their big, Capitol building in Havana there. They renamed the park in front of their building as Revolution Square, and they put a statue of John Lennon sitting on a bench in the middle of the square there, which, so basically they love John Lennon there for whatever reason.
Did they read the lyrics to Revolution? Because if you actually read the lyrics to the Revolution Beatles song, it's actually saying, don't do a revolution.
Right.
Don't be violent and go out and start a revolution. So I don't know if they've actually read the lyrics or not, if they actually get the meaning of the song, but yeah.
It's very strange. And then you also, it's probably too much to go into for this podcast, but I did do an article on it. But Yoko Ono has some interesting connections there too, because Yoko Ono's sister is married to a man who is a very big Castro sympathizer, and has actually been the only non-Cuban to be able to go through Cuban records. And he's like in with the whole Cuban intelligence system. and that he happens to be married to Yoko Ono's sister. And then Yoko Ono, of course, is from Japan and from a very high-ranking financial family, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting kind of ties in there. And I don't know if that has anything at all to do with why they named parts of Guantanamo Bay after Beatles songs, but I guess you never know.
Very bizarre.
So very bizarre.
It is weird.
With the song Imagine, then, an accusation that's constantly levelled at it is that it actually represents some kind of communist manifesto, and it lays out a kind of ideal socialist state according to certain ideals. And that plays right into current times and stuff that's going on with all these celebrities doing the new version of that song. It's as relevant today as it was then on that level.
John had said that himself, that that the song Imagine was the Communist Manifesto, but sugar-coated into a song, and everybody loves it. And in reality, it's just simply the Communist Manifesto. So that was an admittance by himself in a Playboy magazine interview. So, those are his words, not mine, not, anybody else's. That's what...
It's actually my least favourite Lennon song, I think, which is crazy because for most people, when they think of John Lennon's work, the song Imagine is right up there as his greatest achievement in many people's books, but I never really liked it.
Yeah, same here. I'm not that keen on it myself, actually.
Right. And since it's been proposed as the United States new national anthem, is kind of, first of all, John Lennon...
It just gets used all the time. Like the UN, I think, or UNESCO, which is I think it's the child's charity or the child's NGO that's linked to the UNICEF, sorry, isn't it? It's UNICEF that's linked to the UN. It's like the children's branch of the UN, which looks at children's, the agenda that they want to put on the kids, I suppose. Right. And back in 2014, I think it was in 2014, UNICEF, with a particular initiative that they were promoting at the time to do with, wait for it, sustainable development and climate change, the usual things that the UN is very good at, as all these world agenda pushers are. They used Imagine as like the anthem back in 2014 for that. And I don't know if you guys remember, they actually did... Like we're talking about this Corona drama version song of Imagine that came out recently during the lockdown, where they've got various... I haven't listened to it. I just can't do it. I'm sorry, I just cannot do it. But apparently a load of quote-unquote celebrities have got together and recorded like a little bit of the lines from the song, and then they were all kind of put together and this like mix was done. Well, this is what happened in 2014. What they did was they invited people to get this app and then to record their own version of Imagine. And I think what happened was, I'm not exactly sure, but I think what happened was somebody edited this all down into a version and made so it was basically different people from all over the world, children, I think, singing Imagine, just like little bits of the line each from the song. And it was remixed by David Guetta. The DJ David Guetta.
And the irony is, Imagine is probably the least imaginative song choice that could have been made when there are so many other options available.
Well, it's dreary. Too. Right, and I don't know if you guys have ever really noticed, but it seemed like even when it was released, John never really seemed to like the song very much. He was always kind of saying, oh, this was mainly Yoko. Yoko did most of this. This isn't me. This is Yoko. Like, he always kind of pawned it off on somebody else. Even though it was like his signature song in a lot of ways.
Have you noticed this podcast has become Pick on Yoko podcast?
I know. I'm sorry, Yoko.
Well, it's usually Ringo, to be fair.
Yeah. But it's true. That's what he did. He did say that. He said it was Yoko's. He said, like sort of paraphrasing, is, I'm a bit of a bastard because basically I've been taking credit for this song for all these years, but actually it was Yoko's lyrics, words from one of her poetry books. I think it was the Grapefruit poetry book, the book called Grapefruit, where she's got this, imagine this, imagine that, imagine if this, imagine if that. And he basically sort of plagiarized that and worked on that. So basically what he's saying is it was Yoko's thing. So yeah, so there you go. So if you want to put the blame on it, so it's back to her again, isn't it? But hey,
something else
that's saying this is what other people are saying. So
something else that's very current and timely and ties into other stuff going on at the moment is just looking at this article from the Daily Express talking about the Peter Jackson Let It Be tribute movie Get Back, which was scheduled for release this year, has now been put back to 2021, along with everything else, it seems. And what's quite alarming about it is that this article says it's been put back all the way to the 27th of August 2021. So we've got to hope that doesn't hint at inside knowledge on the part of these filmmakers that that's how long it's going to take for things to get back to normal and for audiences to start going out to cinemas properly again.
Yeah, like you say, that's the one film that all true Beatles fans want to see, because you've got all these hours and hours and hours. I don't know how many hours there is, but maybe nearly 100 hours, maybe, of footage of them in the studio, rehearsing, going through songs we've never heard before, doing covers, doing jam sessions and what have you. And we've only heard like not, just a tiny couple of centimeters, a couple of inches of worth of that, So this is the one movie that all real Beatles fans want to see and hear, because they're hoping that with the release of this film will come a box set, basically, with all this stuff. But yeah, so it's a shame in that respect, but it's scary because, like you say, Mark, what do they know that we don't know? Have they been told that there is going to be no public activity going on until next year?
Exactly. Well, it's a similar situation too with the new James Bond movie, No Time to Die, which was scheduled originally to be released in April, but then when all this stuff broke in March, the filmmakers announced that they'd put it back to November of 2020 for its full release. So that's a slightly better option if that hints at knowledge that by November people will be going back to cinemas properly again. But you have to wonder how much these corporations and these filmmakers know about what's going to be coming and what the timescale is.
Yeah, because we've had re-releases of the other Beatles movies, A Hard Day's Night, Help, Magical Mystery Tour, Yellow Submarine, countless times. First, when video became the thing in the 80s, all these films were re-released on video, and then DVD, and then Blu-ray, and on and on and on, and box sets and this and that and the other. But always with Let It Be, it never happens. Let It Be hasn't actually been on British TV since 1981 or 82, and it's never been screened since. I've actually got a video copy of that. I taped it back then when I was about 11, 12, so I've got it, and I'll take very good care of that.
Complete at that time, right? It was just bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, bits and pieces. An hour and a half, 90 minutes of what was, some say 90 hours or 100 or so hours of footage, film footage and audio. And we got 90 minutes or thereabouts. So that's why everyone who's into the Beatles wants to see. They don't care about A Hard Day's Night and Help. And all right, we've seen that. Bring us the meat, bring us the real stuff. And this will be great for anyone who's into PID as well, because then they can look into, hopefully they won't mess about too much with the film, and you can look out for quote unquote clues, if there's anything going on there, if there's a double or whatever. But yeah, maybe that's why it's not coming out. Maybe there's a little few things they need to iron out with the doubles, whether McCartney died or not. Doubles do exist, so whether in the Beatles or not, they do exist. So maybe that's why they're pulling back on it all the time, because it's like a documentary film, so it's not as easy to manipulate as you can a movie, fictional movie where people are wearing makeup and masks, or there's doubles. There are real doubles, stunt doubles, or in the case of Yellow Submarine, which is animated,
that weren't supposed to be there.
Yeah, maybe really this is it
about it, and so the part that everybody always thought was John Lennon playing was actually played by a session musician, and they're not sure exactly how to go about that.
Yeah, how to doctor it and how to. I think there are the Nagra tapes you can find. They're called the Nagra tapes, NAGRA. If you look at those, you can get transcripts of the conversations that were going on. Someone's actually sat down and transcribed it all onto a website. So that's quite interesting to look at. There's a few little bits and pieces on there. Okay. But do you want me to mention a bit about Star Spangled Banner, and just to wrap that up, because it might tie into what Desiree was saying about the whole communist thing. Maybe.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know if this might be an inspiration, Desiree. Apparently, what happened was when the BLM thing kicked off a few weeks after that, 2 weeks or whatever. There's a writer and an author, and he's also been described as an activist and a public speaker and a filmmaker. He's called Kevin Powell, and he's the guy actually that said, "Hey, let's make Imagine." Basically, what he said was, "Let's get rid of the Star Spangled Banner and replace it with something like, hey, I don't know, Imagine." And from him saying that, it became headline news for about a day or two, and then it kind of fizzled out. So this is his actual quote, and which is what caused the headlines. He says, "The Star Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key, who was literally born into a wealthy slaveholding family in Maryland. He was a very well-to-do lawyer in Washington, D.C., and eventually became very close to President Andrew Jackson, who was the Donald Trump of his time," which means that there was a lot of hate and violence and division. At that time, there were attacks on Native Americans and black folks, both free black folks and folks who were slaves. And Francis Scott Key was very much a part of that. He was also the brother-in-law of someone who became a Supreme Court Justice, Roger Taney, who also had a very hardcore policy around slavery. And so all of that is problematic. And the fact that Key, when he was a lawyer, also prosecuted abolitionists, both white and black folks who wanted slavery to end. And yet we celebrate him with this national anthem every time we sing it. He goes on, "I grew up in hip hop, and I remember how people would criticize hip hop for being violent. Yet the Star Spangled Banner is riddled with violence. How are you criticizing a rap song for being violent? But when you get to kindergarten, we are literally teaching children violence through song. So what should America's new national anthem be?" And Powell suggests John Lennon's Imagine, which he says, and I quote, "is the most beautiful, unifying, all people, all backgrounds together kind of song you could have." Okay, so I looked a bit into Kevin Powell. I think this is going to blow over, but you know, who knows? But apparently, according to one source I've come across, he's a writing fellow for the Joint Centre for Political and Economics Studies. And according to their About page on their official website, it was formed in 1970. So it was right in the middle of all the demonstrations that were going on at the time with the Black Panthers and anti-Vietnam, and you had John Lennon doing his stuff as well with the protests. It was, you know, a very volatile time. This is when it was created, and it's described, according to its own website, its official website, as America's Black Think Tank. It's an NGO, basically, a not-profit organisation based in Washington. Right, well, if you look at the list of their supporters, you've got Facebook. You've also got Microsoft, and actually, and not only that, one of the Paula H. Boyd, who's on the board of, I think she's on the board of directors for this organisation, actually is, I think she's classed as director of government and regulatory affairs for Microsoft Corporation. She actually works for Microsoft, and part of her job is, quote unquote, according to this website, part of her job is to do with issues surrounding internet governance. And another supporter, and I'll close this off now. Another supporter of this organisation is the Open Society Foundations, which of course is the George Soros, and also the Ford Foundation is a supporter of the centre. And if I'm not mistaken, the Ford Foundation also bankrolls, or has bankrolled, financially supported this organisation as well. And this Powell, this what's his name again? Kevin Powell is also supported by Gloria Steinem, who was very well known in the 60s and 70s. She's still around with us now, still doing her bit. A journalist and a well-known feminist from the 60s, as I say, and early 70s predominantly as well. And it wasn't it CIA asset, exactly. It turns out that in the late 50s and up until 1967, as far as we know, she was working for the CIA, and has admitted it herself. going to youth festivals. I think it's described as a CIA front organization, which was basically a CIA front, but its cover basically was going to youth organizations. That's what she did on behalf of the CIA, going to youth organizations in Europe. And apparently, according to her, quote, "In my experience, the agency was completely different from its image. It was liberal, non-violent, and honourable." Yeah. So, and apparently she interviewed John Lennon in 1964 for Cosmopolitan magazine, if that means anything. But so yeah, there's the little bits I found out about this individual and his background. Yeah, George Soros is right in there.
So we've gone from arguably John's most famous song, Imagine, to Paul's most celebrated song, which would be Yesterday. And that ties in with the recent movie Yesterday. And there are claims of plagiarism going on here. And this is something we wanted to discuss. So Matt, do you want to take up that one?
Yeah, there's... anyone who knows, if you listen to the first, I think it was our first ever Magical Mystery Talk podcast, we talked a bit about Yesterday, the movie, which is Richard Curtis. That's his name, isn't it? Richard Curtis, the man who's famous for putting together the movie Four Weddings and a Funeral, for example.
All
in
of
the
which
last,
are illegal right now. Sorry, I had to put that in.
Pardon?
I said all of which are illegal right now. The Four Weddings and a Funeral.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I just realised. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
No weddings and plenty of funerals. Welcome to 2020.
Yeah. And with COVID on all the death certificates. Yeah.
Of course.
But let's not go there.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. There was this.
Did they put COVID on Astrid's certificate? Be a missed opportunity if they didn't. They probably did.
Not that I'm aware of.
Well,
again, her death. There's been no. She passed away. That's all I'm aware of.
On my birthday this year. She actually died on my birthday, 12th of May.
I think she was 85 or 86.
81, apparently.
Oh, 81. Okay. Yeah, so the Yesterday film, we talked about it in the first instalment of Magical Mystery Talk, and it's basically this movie that was put together, so it's said, or so we're told, that's how the media and the mainstream media tells us, and indeed if you go to the movie theatre and watch it, you'll see it in the credits. It's a Richard Curtis movie, screenplay by Richard Curtis, directed by Danny Boyle. It's in the last few months it's come to light. There's an individual by the name of Jack Barth, and he's claiming, now if you actually watch the film, you'll see it does actually say story by Jack Barth. I think that's his name, Jack Barth or Jake Barth. I think it's Jack Barth. Story by Jack Barth, and then screenplay by Richard Curtis. Now, this Barth individual has come out in recent times. He's a screenwriter, budding screenwriter. He's actually been in the business for over 40 years. As far as I'm aware, he writes for magazines, he writes articles, and he's also written a episode of The Simpsons as well. And he does scripts. I think he's done some scripts for TV shows, some other TV shows and stuff. He's not super famous. He's not even moderately famous. He's just a jobbing writer. Now he's come out in recent months claiming that Yesterday was actually actually came about because of him. If it hadn't have been for him, then this Yesterday movie would never have happened. And basically what's happened is that he's been ousted. He's been pushed aside with all the plaudits and the money, basically, and the credit going to Richard Curtis and also Danny Boyle. What he claims is he came up with the story for this film in 2012, 2013, and his version of the film is called Cover Version. And it's quite obvious why it's called Cover Version, because if you watch Curtis's version of Yesterday, you see this guy who kind of has a motorcycle crash or a scooter crash. He's on a moped or something. He wakes up in the hospital. His face is bashed, and he wakes up in this other world where the Beatles have never been heard of. He's a budding musician, ambitious musician. So what he does is he realizes that no one's heard of the Beatles. So he passes himself off as being the songwriter of all these Beatles classics, and hence, and as a result, I should say, he then becomes a huge worldwide star off the back of it. Now, Barth's version of his cover version is very different actually, but the premise is the same. That you have this new reality, basically, where no one's heard of the Beatles, and there's a musician, a budding musician, an ambitious musician who takes the Beatles songs and passes them off.
A new
Everyone
normal,
thinks
you might say,
his.
Matt.
Sorry?
A new normal, you might even
say. A
say.
new normal, yeah. Yeah, but not as horrible as this new normal, eh? So what Jack Barth claims, is that he came up with this script cover version in 2012, 2013, and he gave it to his agent. His agent then, through a chain of events, the agent passes it to another person, the person passes it to someone else, and through a chain of events, a few years later, it turns up in the lap of Richard Curtis. And this is Barth's version of what happened. He sees this script for cover version and he likes it, and he says, "Yeah, I want to do this." So at that point, there's negotiations going on between Barth, his agent, and Curtis and all his people in his production company. Now, Barth is under the impression that Curtis wants to take this film and be the producer of it. So basically, I suppose, to finance it, to back it. But actually, no, what Curtis wanted to do with it, according to Barth, was to actually take the credit for it. He says, "I will." What Barth claims is Curtis, during the negotiation, said, "I want to get all the credit for this story, for this movie. With all I'll give Jack is story by. This is a story by Jack Barth. That's the only credit he's going to get. But screenplay is going to be me, by Richard Curtis." So Jack's a bit taken out by this. But he claims he just thought, "Look, I've had this script for 5, 6, 7 years or whatever. Look, I'll get paid, I'll get my fee, and I'll just move on." So he gets a modest fee, so he claims, a modest fee for a movie that then went on to accumulate millions across the world. So he goes off, and then the movie eventually comes out a year or 2 or 3 later or whatever. And Barth claims that he was expecting to be included in the promotion for it. And he was a little bit put out again when he realised that no one was calling him from the production, from the film studios, from the production office to ask him to take part, maybe to go to the premiere or to take part in interviews and what have you. And that he claims they said to him, that the film studio said to him, was that they didn't want him to be included in that the whole film was going to be centred on Richard Curtis and also the director Danny Boyle. It was going to be, quote unquote, the dream duo film, team partnership, the two British legends of British film getting together to work together on this thing that's all theirs, with, in little print, story by Jack Barth. And then he realizes that not only is he being pushed out of, so he claims, he realizes that not only is he being pushed out of the press and the media and everything, but he's also realized in interviews that Richard Curtis is giving that he's actually been eased out of the whole story. What Richard Curtis is then saying, and I've got quotes, I think I've found actual quotes. I'm not too sure if I can verify them, but there are actual quotes where Richard Curtis is saying in interviews, "Yeah, well, what happened was someone was presumably on the phone to him, read him the first line of the cover version script, at which point Richard Curtis told the person that was reading it to him to stop. And he told the person that was reading it to him, 'Stop right there. I don't want to know any more. I've got the germ of the idea. That's all I need. Don't read me the rest because you'll ruin it. I've got the idea in my head. I don't need any more. That's all I need to know.'" And you'll find, if you look for quotes about Richard Curtis talking about this, it does appear that he does say, "I had a germ of an idea that was given to me from a script." Barth totally, dismisses this. He says, no, he saw the script and he read it. He read the script and then he decided that he wanted to take the whole credit apart from this small credit that Jack got. So that's his gripe, basically, that they've gone on to generate all these millions. And I think what's really peed him off is that when it came to promoting it, he wasn't invited to go along to take part in it all. It was all Richard Curtis and Danny Boyle. And Barth has actually said that he said to people, "Did you know that I came up with this idea?" And even his friends and his colleagues are saying to him, "Oh, shut up. How dare you insult Richard Curtis? This man is a filmmaking legend. How dare you even, insinuates such.
Sounds like Carter Whitelow and J Electronica all over again. Another article from your blog.
And you could even say it's another version of Yesterday, but a real life version. If Jack's claims an imposter taking on someone else's work and claiming it for himself.
Well, we've spoken before on here about the idea of Dr. Richard Asher and all his work on hypnotism and sleep studies, and the suggestion that he may have implanted the melody to the song Yesterday in Paul McCartney's mind as some sort of mind control experiment. It's another aspect to it. I
won't go too much into this, but you can actually read the script, okay? I'll try and find the web address in just a second or two. For this cover version, you can actually read the script. I've read the script. I read it last night. I just happened to find it. I thought, wow, it's actually online. I don't know how many versions. I mean, it's obviously with scripts, I'm no great expert, but I presume that what they do is they write one version and then they do another treatment of it and then another one and then another one. So I don't know what version of this is, whether it's the original or whether it's a few down the line, as it were, but I found it. And I just want to mention this because it does kind of tie into PID. Now, if you've watched Yesterday, you'll know, and we talked about this briefly in the first episode of Magical Mystery Talk, where it would appear that Yesterday is full of PID clues. Like you've got Jack, who's involved in a crash, in a moped crash. I won't get into too much of the details about how a moped crash ties into PID, because in PID, of course, depending on which version you believe, one of the versions is that the real Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash in September or November, depending on what version you believe, in 1966. But prior to that, about a year or two before that, Paul was involved in a crash. So he says now, so this version says, because we've seen the photographs of what happened in this crash. Allegedly was his face got bashed, his tooth was chipped, his lip was bruised and cut open, and he had black eyes, and there are photographs of, I think it was Mike McCartney's Paul's brother, who took pictures of Paul in this pose. How that fits into PID, I think, I might be wrong, I don't know, Desiree, but I think how that fits into PID is there are some researchers who believe that he wasn't actually in a moped crash, though actually what happened was he was beaten up. He was abducted by other forces and assaulted, basically, to keep his mouth shut about certain things. And you can see clues of those injuries as well in the Paperback Writer video. If you watch the video for Paperback Writer with the Beatles, which came out in 1966, you can see when Paul's singing, he opens his mouth and he's got a chipped tooth and his lip is slightly swollen. So he's still got the effects of whatever it was that happened. Anyway, so in the movie Yesterday, the guy, Jack, isn't that funny? Jack, why would Richard Curtis call the character Jack? But yeah, so he's Jack, and he has a crash, and then he wakes up in a hospital and his face is bashed, and one of his teeth is chipped, and then he wakes up and it's an alternate world, and then with this new non-Beatles reality, and then he goes to a party, a welcome home party, and it's an outside garden type party, I think, from what I can gather from the film, and there's a banner on the building behind him which says "Welcome Jack back from the dead," I think it says, or something like that. And then later on in the film, he has a flashback scene where he gets pangs of guilt, I think, doesn't he? He gets pangs of guilt for feeling that he's conned the world basically into thinking that he's written these Beatles songs and he's become a star from it. And he has this moment in the film where he gets like a fit of guilt. And then you see him have this like dream-like sequence where he's on a chat show. And then the chat show host says, "Ladies and gentlemen, in the studio, we have Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr." And all you see is feet walking up the stairs at the top of the auditorium, and one of the feet has got bare feet. So you've got all these, and there's other bits in the film, and we talked about this, that there's all these seemingly PID type clues in Richard Curtis's film. If you read the script of cover version, there's none of that. There are no PID clues whatsoever. The only reference he makes to PID is very, very brief, and it's not even PID. It's just it's just ridiculous. It's completely different. There are no clues whatsoever. In his version, in the cover version film, it's set in 2006. It's based on a guy called Dan, again, who's an ambitious musician, and he's in a 4-piece band with his girlfriend, and they've had one hit. And the film starts with them in this quite a nice club. So the script describes it's quite a nice club. It's a glitzy club, and they're performing in this club. They're doing okay. They've had one hit in the charts. It's a cover version, so it's not one of theirs. Not a Beatles one, but it's a cover of an old 60s song, I think. And then the movie in the script, it describes how the movie then fast forwards 10 years. So these group of youngsters that were in their 20s are now in their 30s, and they're still in this band, but they've experienced no other success. So basically they've gone back. They're getting less and less famous, and they're playing in dingy clubs. They're not playing in such glitzy clubs anymore. And a few of them in the band have actually got other jobs to keep them going, because that was it. That one hit with that cover was it, and then they kind of disappeared, and that was as far as it went for them. And the story goes that they're in the studio one day, and they're working on one of Dan's songs, and they can't get it together. And then he gets a text message from his father, Brian. His father's called Brian. And the text says, "I've locked myself out of the house," because he lives with his dad. "I've locked myself out of the house. Can you come and meet me and give me the key?" So he goes into the streets of London, where the film is based. It's based in London. He goes into the streets of London, and to cut a long story short, while he's waiting there, suddenly his father comes and he gives him the key, and then he turns around, and then suddenly everything goes psychedelic. This is how the script describes it. Everything goes psychedelic. It's like he's having an LSD trip. He's looking at people, and when they're walking, there are traces behind them, and there's psychedelic trippy music going on in the background. It looks like he's having a bit of a turn. He doesn't feel too good. And then he looks on the road and he sees a zebra crossing, and he sees 4 men who look like the Beatles from 1969 era walking across a zebra crossing. Then he sees a yellow Rolls Royce race past and nearly knock these 4 men who look like the Beatles over. And he looks in the yellow Rolls Royce, and it's his father. And the yellow Rolls Royce careers off the road and hits the sidewalk, the pavement, and then that's how the script describes it. And then he gets himself together again, and kind of gets his thoughts back together again. And then he goes back to the studio, and he sits down. And this session that him and his band have been working on has not been working at all. They're trying to work on this song that he's written, and it's just not happening. So he starts to strum on the guitar, and he starts strumming Yesterday. Now, this is exactly what happened in the actual Curtis, so-called Curtis version, isn't it? He's playing Yesterday, but in a different scenario. But he's playing Yesterday, and his friends say, "Hey, what's that song?" And he says, "It's the Beatles." And they say, "Who are the Beatles?" Well, this is exactly what happens, but in a different scenario in this cover version of the film. So they say, and he says it's the Beatles, and they say, "Who are the Beatles?" And so, "Are you having a laugh?" So he looks on the internet. All he can find about Beatles are the Volkswagen car and the insect, and then he looks under insects for bands, and all he comes up with is Buddy Holly and the Crickets and the Scorpions. Remember them, and things like that. So then that's when he decides to appropriate, let's say, the Beatles songs, thinking that it's going to give him worldwide fame. But the difference between the cover version script and the Yesterday version, whereas in Yesterday Jack becomes a huge star, in the cover version he doesn't. He thinks that by taking on these songs and playing them, that people are going to think that, wow, what a genius this guy is. This guy is a genius songwriter. What a star. That doesn't happen to him. In fact, they get slightly better gigs, slightly better live gigs, but they don't actually go any much further than that. So there's the difference between the two. And as I say, the only kind of reference there is to Bare Feet or PID, if you like. If it is a reference to PID, it might not be. It might be just a reference to the Abbey Road album cover. He's fixated on trying to make this band work. So he not only appropriates the Beatles' music, but he tries to appropriate the Beatles' image as well. And the band breaks up that he's with. The band are called Clay Enema, I think, this band he's with. And what he says to them is, "Right, guys, we're going to record a new album, and I want us to go to Abbey Road Studios, the zebra crossing, and to cross the road there. And they're going, Abbey Road Studios, what's that? Never heard of it. But anyway, so they go to Abbey Road, and he wants one of the band members to take his shoes off and his socks and to walk across the road barefoot. Apparently a row ensues because this band member is thinking, why do you want me to do that? I don't get it. Obviously not understanding why. So basically this band breaks up because an argument breaks out because this band member will not take his shoes off and walk across the road barefoot. So then after the band breaks up, he then goes and starts another band, and he has them dress up like mop-top Beatles with the collarless shirts and the comb down hair, trying to recreate the early. But again, it doesn't work, and he can't make out why it's not working because he's got the songs, but the audience aren't really going for them. And not only aren't the audience going for them, but the members in his band aren't really that big on them either. And the moral of this story basically is that he then realizes is that it's not the songs themselves that are the magic. It's the people that are making the songs and performing the songs and the energy that they're putting across in the songs that are actually making them the classics that they are. It just needs that extra ingredient to make those songs work. I think that's the moral of the story. But in this film also, John Lennon, he meets John Lennon. He's a sailor on a ship. He's a fisherman. He's got his own boat. He just makes a simple living as a fisherman in Liverpool. He's married to Cynthia. And he was in a band in the 50s. And the only person that's had success out of the four so-called Beatles is Ringo, who's not called Ringo. What he does is he gets to a point where he has, like in the Yesterday film, where Jack has this crisis of, conscience. There's a part towards the end of the script in cover version, Dan has that same crisis of confidence. And in the end, he decides to go to Liverpool and to find out if these who would have been the Beatles, if they're still around, or if they're around. So he does a bit of a search on the internet and he tracks down John Lennon. He finds out that George died in 2001. Just lived a regular life, doesn't find out too much about George apart from he died of cancer in 2001. And he finds out that Richard Starkey, aka Ringo Starr, although he's not called Ringo in this script, Richard Starkey has a one-hit wonder in 1969 with Octopus's Garden. And from the royalties of that massive one-hit wonder, he goes to America and becomes the owner of a hair salon. Becomes a hairdresser. So basically he's the only one that's found riches and a certain amount of fame from this one hit that he has. But yeah,
his own brand of hair dye.
With his own, yeah, please no, that makes old men's hair look like terracotta. And he also goes into a market stall and buys some fruit in Liverpool. He goes to Liverpool to find John, and the person that sells him the fruit is Paul McCartney. So he's basically a market fruit seller. But he actually talks to John. He sits on the boat. He passes himself off as a journalist because he doesn't want John to know that he's a musician. He doesn't want to cause too much attention. So he lies to him and tells him he's a journalist from London who's looking at the lives of fishermen in Britain. So he goes on the boat with John and he tries to find out as much as he can. He asks him, hey, did you ever get into music? And apparently what happened was John says, yeah, I was into music in the 50s. I was in a little skiffle band. We were called the Quarrymen. And he goes, do you remember who was in that band? He goes, oh, God, no, that was years ago. But we were quite good, But yeah, we stopped. We stopped after a while because, we were just playing Chuck Berry and Little Richard, doing rock and roll songs. But everybody was, so we kind of gave it up. Apparently he was at art college as well, just like the John Lennon that we know. And he was chucked out of art college, thrown out of art college. And then he decides to go and work on a boat. And then he saved up and he became a fisherman. So basically what we have here is an alternate universe basically going on, but there is absolutely no references really to PID, Paul is Dead, any of that. The references are coming from the direction of Richard Curtis. That's where they're coming from.
And again, you've got to wonder with those differences between cover version and Yesterday, whether the embellishments by Richard Curtis may have been in direct response to what alternative researchers have been putting out there about the Beatles and all related issues, whether, certain parties there have been keeping an eye on what's being said on the internet and aspects of it were deliberately placed into the new version of the screenplay.
That's why I mentioned it.
That barefooted scene was completely intentional. I mean, it had to be. Just things like that. It's just like, it was completely I call it like a sync wink. It was like, a nod and a nudge and a wink to all the Beatles alternative mystery seekers out there. It feels that way. It feels that way for sure.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have mentioned it. I wouldn't have mentioned the script. But the fact is that somebody came up with the PID element. It's obvious, and it's not coming from the original script. It's coming from the direction of the bigwigs, Richard Curtis, Danny Boyle, perhaps, maybe even his wife, Curtis's wife, who's Emma Freud, who are, the connections to the Freud family. Wow,
We may be having more of an impact than we realise. Anyway, guys, we pretty much reached the 2-hour mark now, so I think we'll wrap this one up. We certainly do want to come back in December of this year, because that will be the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's death in December 1980. We definitely need to mark that occasion. I like to think that we could get another one in before that, but things being as they are in this rather unusual year of 2020, who knows how it's going to pan out. So we'll certainly be back in December, if not before. So thanks to you two for taking part today. Thanks to everyone for listening.
And if anyone wants to find the cover version script, I'll be posting it to my site, The Occult Beatles. But if you want to go look for it yourself, you can find it if you go to if you just type in scriptshadow.net, and then if you type in after that screenplay review cover version, you'll find the script on there. There's a PDF of it, so you can have a look for yourself. It's actually more entertaining. That version of the film is actually better than the drivel that came out courtesy of Curtis and Boyle. But yeah, so there you go. That's me done.
And Desiree, do you just want to remind people where to find your blog and word of any new articles you've got up on there?
Let's see, I have a ton of articles. Not much too new has come out, but working on stuff. But I'm at the number9blog.wordpress.com.
All right, well, I think we're about done. Hope to catch everyone again for episode 4. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Yes.